Greetings, everyone. This is our last of 3 videos where we are studying the prehistoric art of Japan. We've already looked at the Jomon period, the earliest period where we looked at very lively pottery and remarkable figurines known as dogu dolls or dogu figurines. Then we looked at the Yayoi, which is a very different kind of aesthetic and a culture coming up from the south. And I'll review a bit of that now. And now in this last video, we're going to focus on what is essentially the last period of prehistoric, that is before we have written records, called the Kofun, named after a very distinctive and remarkable tumulus or tomb structure known as a keyhole tomb, which we will look at. So let us first quickly have a quick look at a few works from the Yayoi to kind of orient ourselves and continue into the Kofun period. Okay, so let me quickly play the slideshow. Right, so we've looked at the Jomon culture, which is the earliest culture going back from 10,000 BC to 3000 BCE. And then we've turned in our second video to the Yayoi culture and looked at a very different kind of aesthetic coming up, probably from principally Korea, and also with influences from mainland China, especially in relationship to bronze. Many important technological advances were brought into Japan through the Yayoi culture, leading to a more complex culture. And with that complexity came works such as these bronze works demonstrating the Yayui's understanding of the techniques of metallurgy coming from China, but what is notable is the very distinct style that is explored and expressed through the Yayoi, which can be only related to this culture and is not derivative. We ended our last lecture looking at this magnificent bronze bell, a dotaku coming from Yayoi, and I linked it lightly to Shinto. And again, I encourage you, I'm not talking about Shinto in these videos. It's a very important spiritual belief that continues to the present day in China. And we can trace that system of understanding the world in relation to kind of energized spirits, which are having a kind of intelligence. We engage with to some of the aesthetic that we see on something like these bronze bells, these flowing water, for example. So now we're turning to the third of the 3 periods, diagram of the bronze bells from last lecture, called the Kofun period. The Kofun period lasts from 300 to 710 CE. So we're moving forward into beyond the BCE period. And the Kofun period is named, the term itself, Kofun, is named after these extraordinary, huge mounded tombs that are found mostly in the area of Yamamoto Plains near Osaka. And we may understand these to be part of a very elaborate burial practice by elite Yayoi members of society. And what we're looking at here is the largest of the Kofun tumuli. Kofun means tumuli, so tumuli is an English word. And it is believed to be, scholars accept that it is the tomb of Emperor Nintu. And the size of this tomb, which is shaped like a keyhole, is enormous. It's 110 1,950 square meters, about 458 acres. The total volume is one where if one person could move about 1 cubic meter of earth a day, it would have taken 1,000 people working daily 4 years to complete the mound. So it's a vast and massive undertaking. One tends to think of the great Egyptian pyramids, another tomb, which took vast amounts of labor and time to create. And the Japanese cultural legacy here is well preserved in an otherwise urban part of Osaka. And the Yamato Plain in Osaka is near the Seto Inland Sea. So this is somewhat, so the majority of these, and there are hundreds, you can see some of them are quite a bit smaller, are found in this region here, with a south-facing shore towards the Sea of Seto that we looked at a little bit in our introduction to the geography of Japan, in our first, in the lecture on your previous page on geography and introduction to Japan. Now, here's another view. There is, in Japan as a whole, there are more than 20,000 of these tumuli, which are mounds of earth and stones erected over graves of the ruling class. They were built beginning in the later part of the 3rd century BCE and the 6th century. And it was a peak period of building such mounds. They represent a cultural tradition, which is an expression of forms and designs of the socio-political hierarchical order and the link that was prevalent during that period between regions. So we have these massive tombs that 20,000 of which are in Japan are an important way that we can see the connectedness of this Yayoi, of the Kofun culture, which some see as an extension of the Yayoi, but we articulate it differently because we suddenly see these tombs appear, and we don't in the earlier Yayoi, so we call it something new, Kofun, after these remarkable tombs. As you can see, they're very keyhole shaped, the border around them, and here is a nice diagram to give you an idea of more of what they looked like without the significant vegetation that is growing over them. They are stepped. They have a trapezoidal shape and most likely had a ritual altar at the top. Inside were objects that belong to the elite ruling class. And what we are going to focus on is a particular way in which objects appear around these structures, which I'll turn to in a minute. But here is yet, because these are a bit hard to conceptualize in the middle of an urban center, here is another reconstruction without the urban Osaka all around it to give you an idea of what these look like. They're really, they're incredible. They're magical to a contemporary eye. I mean, these enormous keyholes that makes it look like the earth is a door and we're going to open and enter, and it's inside is the deceased, and it's it feels like a very literal metaphor. Whether the keyhole is our later tool of a key and a lock, which no such thing existed at this time. So we bring that metaphorical magic, mental magic to these objects. These are just simply structural forms that are created that to us resemble a keyhole. And again, there are many different sizes, and some you can see here are circular, which in fact is what were the earlier types. They eventually evolved into these forms here. You can see they're surrounded by a body of water. Obviously, there's a sense of protecting the deceased within. Now, here is a nice, they're not the color of yellow in this diagram. This is from the Chikatsu Asuka Museum, which has offered a reconstruction, small model reconstruction of a kofun with a number of, not many vessels that would have been punctuating the outlines of the different tiers and levels of the kofun. And these were cylindrical pots initially. Here's some examples. And it's thought that these early cylindrical works decorated with bands of raised clay, here you can see them, maybe brings us back to our analysis of pottery. They were probably molded, they were probably created over a mold, like a tube, and then not thrown on a wheel. And then the mold was removed, and we have our basic shape. This would allow for relatively efficient production of these. And these are known as haniwa, literally clay circles. And the scholars believe or have proposed that these ceramics evolved from specialized pedestaled vessels used to make ritual offerings of food and drink to the dead. And think back to the bronze vessels from the Zhou dynasty and the Shang dynasty, and the ritual offerings to the deceased were these elaborate ding pots, for example. This is a very different relationship to a vessel. It's a very different kind of externalized vessel rather than one that's buried with the deceased. And how these, what kinds of ritual offerings these were, we don't know, but this is the theory by scholars. It is accepted as a theory. Shortly after the start of the Kofun period, haniwa makers began to add forms modeled to resemble tools, military equipment, and animals on the tops of the cylindrical haniwa. So suddenly we have various figures and forms begin to appear that are suggestive of daily life of the deceased. We have some of the famous are the elaborate house-shaped haniwa. Here we're looking at one here. Thought to have served, again, these are theories by scholars, as a symbolic dwelling for the soul of the dead. Here we have a fence, circular fence, closed. One wonders if within that fence a sacred space was created through a boundary. And this is known as a morning glory pot. There are very many of them, and we find these in abundance. Here's just a bird's eye view, topographical view of a tumuli kofun. Tumuli and kofun are the same thing. They're just different words to say. Tumuli means tomb in English, and kofun means the same kind of tomb in Japanese. It's believed, again, scholars believe that these kinds of objects were used in funerary rites to further protect the soul and to guarantee abundant harvests in the nearby rice paddies. You might remember again with the pots of the Zhou and the Shang, especially the Shang dynasty, we find a deep belief in the agency of ancestors to act on behalf of the living. And so by properly giving offerings and feeding of the dead, you wouldn't want like a hungry ghost of the dead to intervene negatively or act negatively in the present. So, this is a similar kind of idea applied to very different objects. There is no bronze here. These are to our eyes, very charming, sweet kind of forms that only grow and appeal as they evolve into figurative forms. Just here is, again, to kind of keep you visualizing the way these would work. They would be placed on or around this kofun in serving a ritual function of some kind. Now, by the middle of the 5th century, the sculpture repertoire of Haniwa expanded to include human figures portrayed as warriors, shamans, farmers, entertainers, falconers, or other social types. So it's a community now in these kind of figurative forms, all hollow and all rather tubular and cylindrical, harkening back to these vessels, the initial kind of very cylindrical vessels we discussed as our first examples of haniwa, which literally means circle. At first, these figural works were relegated to the outer embankments encircling tombs. They later came to adorn the mound itself, forming rows with other sculpted and cylindrical haniwa on the flat terraces constructed along the slopes of a tomb mound or kofun, partially embedded in the soil at the base of the tomb. So here are reconstructions of these haniwa, figurative haniwa, and how they might appear with the earlier vessel types. And then we have a morning glory pot here. Horse, it looks like. And then here is a nice schematic. This is from a Japanese archaeological essay. These are diagrams of locations where haniwa were excavated in the Tuxamawari, Kofun, Sakai, Osaka Prefecture in the city of Ota. We have figures. We have a charming seated figure, horses, and various other kind of forms here. So now that we've established the kind of a massive funerary ceremonial earthwork slash almost an architectural form, but it's an earthwork, very well worked land, we can turn now to, and we've understood the relationship of these cylindrical, initially cylinders that ultimately evolved. We can now focus on the object, the figurative manifestation of these, which is the last manifestation of the haniwa, because they are so characteristic or so much associated with a kind of Japanese aesthetic. And so this is a haniwa man carrying a hoe. You see it's over his shoulder. He's happy. He seems to be wearing some kind of headdress or earrings. His smiling, charming face terminates in a point at the top, giving an exquisitely sweet kind of tactile sense of being lifted up or almost rising up, kind of almost like by a forelock. And this upward kind of charming, sweet, ascending energy is continued with these elbows that are raised up, like this figure just can't stop wanting to rise. And then, of course, his body is within the classical cylinder form. And this is just one example. It's very much hollowed out eyes. So, recall that there are holes in these pots here, but now the holes include the eyes and the mouth. So it's striking that there is not, unlike the carving of hands or the carving of some kind of ear shape or even eyebrows, 3 points that are windows into a soul, which is our voice, the sound that comes out of our mouths, and the eyes, which are a deep way of expressing our inner self to another, both of which are open. as though one can go inside the sacred cylinder in a sense, and we're invited to imagine what it contains spiritually. This is in the Tokyo National Museum. It is ultimately these figures moved over time by the 6th century toward militaristic figures. So now one has the sense of these are almost like guardians. They are, which is quite different than the many figures of this type. I maybe should have brought in a few more. Perhaps I'll put some links to some good museum sites so you can smile with me as you look at these charming works, so expressive of souls and spirits, at least, I think, to us as well, and how they were precisely understood in their own time. We don't quite know, but we can negotiate our own humanity and our own feelings in response to these objects and our tactile senses and looking at them, with our understanding of the ritual function of these early vases and the fact that they are around a deceased tomb. So these are engaged in some way with the spirit of the dead, or some idea of the dead, like the living soul, or however it might have been understood. We don't have writing yet, so we can't quite say, but it has to do with the afterlife and the deceased somehow engaging or inhabiting or being protected by these kinds of forms. Certainly, by the time we get to the 6th century, we see armor-clad Haniwa armed with a sword in his right hand and a bow and quiver of arrows. A high level of detail provides insights into the arms and the armor of the warriors of Eastern Japan in the late Kofun period. The Haniwa warrior wears a visorless keeled helmet with protective flaps on either side of the face and behind his head. The small buttons on the helmet show how it was made of small iron plates riveted together. The armor, a type known as kaiko, literally meaning hanging armor, consists of small panels of iron laced together. The detailed modeling shows all the features of the armor, including padded guards for the shoulders, knees, forearms, and legs. You can see here's the padded guards. And here, and here. And shoes as well. Guards on the shoes, padded shoes. The warrior's right hand holds a sword slung from his waist, while his left hand holds a bow. It's a curved bow. Tied just above his left wrist is a device to protect his hand from the bow string. And I actually think here's the bow and this may be the sword. I don't have a back view. I should. This is at the Tokyo National Museum and you can see this sculpture from every angle. But there's a bow and an arrow. The arrows in the quiver on his back have their heads pointed upward. Maybe I'll put an image of him from the back view into your module as well. The 10 loop ties that are visible show how the armor was fastened to the knees. And leg guards, again, this is visible only from behind. And short sleeves protrude from below the shoulder guards. Here you can see that frontally. Several other examples of high-quality Haniwa warriors with similar features have been excavated in the vicinity of Ota City in the Gunma prefecture, suggesting that a center for Haniwa manufacture existed somewhere in this area. What happens with the Kofun as we move into this 7th century is we see a kind of shift to an increasingly militaristic orientation and people who seem quite linked to a horse military culture. So the earlier tombs that we look at seem much more engaged with the nature of the deceased and some kind of ritual offering or feeding to the deceased. And then it seems figures and objects that relate to some element of the experienced world that is linked to the deceased, such as these little houses and gates. And then when we get to the later period, we're really quite seeing a very much more militaristic orientation. And the deceased are surrounded by a mirror of that shift in the Kofun society. And as we progress now in our class, moving into history where we have written records, we can begin to explore, this development of a militaristic culture and emperors and how this crosses with the development of objects related to expressions of power and defense versus objects that are engaging in the Shinto beliefs. And then very significantly, the way in which this now culture that we call Japanese, it's emerged from Yaoi to Kofun, takes and synthesizes and transforms Buddhism in many ways refracted through Taoism. And so, not Taoism, Shinto. Taoism is in China, but there's an analogous element of the flexibility of Taoism to take the Indian Buddhism and move it into a place that was familiar and reinforced the principles of Taoism and brought new principles that worked well with it in the way that Shinto and Buddhism are integrated by the Japanese. And indeed, this is an ongoing story of the Japanese of taking from the external and synthesizing it into their own distinct. So that's where we're going. We are in the 7th century of Japan now, and we're going to enter into a world of history and writing and look at Shinto and then the entrance of Buddhism into Japan in the medieval period in the next centuries. Okay. So I'll see you again in our next videos that are turning to a very different Japan where we have written records.